In this Godot tutorial, I'll teach you how to make a skill tree within your character sheet. Let's get started. So the first thing we have to do is we have to make some space within our character sheet that we created 2 tutorials ago. When we press the skills button, we want this whole stat panel to disappear and we want our skill tree to appear. To do that, I'm going to go into the Hbox container that has everything, both the stats and the buttons. The buttons we of course want to remain, but the stats, we basically want this to just disappear. We can do that through code. All we have to do is replace it with something else. So I'm going to be adding a control node in here. Now control node might seem a little bit unusual at first, but I'm going to be overlapping 2 Hbox containers to create a particular effect that I want, because I want white lines that I can fill up through a texture progress bar to be connecting these skills together to get a really cool effect of when you unlock skills. And for that I need 2 Hbox containers to overlap, so for that I'm using a control node. Now using a control node does of course mean that under the mouse we have to set the filter to ignore, else we wouldn't be able to press any buttons anymore inside that control node. Now with that control node we can rename it, simply call this skills, and I'll immediately add these 2 Hbox containers that I was talking about. This is going to be the skills connector container, and this will be the actual skill tree, or the skills inside the skill tree. Now with that set, we can set this skills. When we now turn off the stats, we can set skills size flag to expand vertically as much as possible. Thereby it takes the same amount of space that previously the stats window did. And on the skills connector, we can set this to be the full rectangle of the control node. Now we have our 2 Hbox containers through which we can add elements that is going to be our skill tree. All we have to do is hook up these 2 buttons underneath. To do that, I'm going to go and close this Hbox, not that Hbox container, this one. I'm going to open up the buttons and I'll say under the stats, I'm going to go to node, signals, and I'm going to connect the press button to the character sheet. We already have that from the previous tutorial. And under skills, I'll do exactly the same. I'll connect the press button on the character sheet. Now, with that done, I'm going to select the control node. I'm going to copy the node path. And when we press skills, we want to do something with that node. So we're going to get the node. And we're going to show it. Now, at the same time that we do that, we of course also want to hide the stats part. So exactly the same, we're going to get that node, going to paste that in, and we're going to hide this. Now when we press the stats button, we of course want exactly the opposite to happen. So we're going to copy and paste this. We'll copy the hide to where we had show, and we'll copy show to where we had hide. We'll save that. Now when we play the game, and we go to our character sheet, we can now switch between the stats and the skills. Of course, the skills are still empty because that's the whole point of this tutorial, to put a skill tree in here. So let's go over to the actual Hbox containers. Let's start adding some skills to it, and then we can start building this puppy up. Now a quick tip, if you want to build a skill tree that goes from left to right or right to left, then you don't want to be adding 2 Hbox containers here, but you want to be adding 2 Hbox containers. You want to invert Hbox and Hbox, then you're going to get vertical swimming lanes in which you can add your different skills. By starting out with a Hbox container, in my example, we're going to be getting horizontal swimming lanes once we're done with this step to add our different skills to. So talking about swimming lanes, yes, let's start creating them. As a starter, I set the alignment for both of the Hbox containers to the end. That means that the Hbox container will push all the nodes to the end and we'll start building up from there. That way we can build the tree up from the bottom up instead of from the top down. Now that's a personal choice. You can just turn it around as well and make it a tree that grows downwards, or whatever you want to call it. I've also set the separation on and kept it at 0 because I want things to not be spaced out at all. When you don't have separation on under the custom constants, then you get a little bit of separation. So make sure you put that on and put it at 0 so you get the right pixel sizes for the various elements, because we're going to be overlapping two Hbox containers, so we want everything to be pretty much pixel perfect as how we have envisioned this. So yeah, put it on for both Hbox containers. Now I'm going to start out with the swimming lanes in these skill trees. That will be the lanes where we add these skills to. We're going to simply add a Hbox container. We'll set this Hbox container up first. The alignment can stay at the beginning, but again we need the separation to be on and at 0. I want our skill icons to be 100 pixels high, so I'm also going to set the height of the Hbox container to 100. Now with that set up, we can now duplicate this Hbox container 2 times, so we have 3 in total, and we can rename the elements. I'm going to rename the top one to number 3, so that will be level number 3. That will be like the most difficult to attain skills. Those will be the intermediate skills, and this will be the skills you start out with, or something similar. Now, if we would add skills to this swimming lane right here, they will be touching these buttons underneath, and there won't be much spacing in between them. That doesn't look good. So we need to add some margin between there. I think a margin of 50 is going to be perfect for us. So that means the skills, the first row, is going to be over there now. But of course, we want some connection lines between the two skills, so we can also show progress or whatever. So we also need some margin between the other two swimming lanes, and I think a margin of 100 will work perfect for what I have prepared for us. I'm going to duplicate this container. I'm also going to put one between the other ones, or the row number 2 and 3. So now we have a row, some margin, another row for skills, some margin, another row for skills, and a little piece of final margin to make sure there's some room in between the skills and the buttons. Now that we have this swimming lane, we can start adding the first skill element that we can copy through into the other rows. So let's add our first skill icon with all the bells and whistles that we'll be needing in this tutorial and future tutorials to create the entire skill tree system. I'm going to go for the first row, and I'll be adding a first container which will have our skill icon. We're going to start with a texture rectangle. That's where the container starts with. We want this to be 100 by 100, as that is the size of our skill icon. And with expand on, I'm going to start by adding a little bit of a background. It's going to be this double edge background. We've used this many times in the tutorial so far. Now with that, we want an icon to appear in there that is a button. It's pressable. So we're going to add a texture button to it. Now this texture button, we can't have it 100 by 100 because then we don't have this background and this border anymore. That's the whole reason why we added that texture. So we're going to make this 90 by 90, and the layout, we'll set it to the center. Now with expand on, because we don't want this to resize anymore, we're going to be adding some skills. So I got these skill icons here. I'll add a normal skill, and I'll also add a disabled function. It's basically a gray skill version of the normal picture. That way we have an option to lock buttons up, and when they're disabled, the player has feedback that it doesn't have, that it didn't unlock that skill yet, and at the same time the button will not be pressable, just like we made the stat system last week. Now with that we have a button, but we want some more to add here. First of all, let's make sure that we have a little bit of an effect that sort of blooms up the moment the player unlocks a skill. We want to, reward the player, give some stuff to him, make it a little bit interesting for him. So we're going to add another texture rectangle. And in that texture rectangle, I'll set that layout to be the full rectangle, 100 by 100. And to it, I'll add this gradient circle effect. Before I do that, I have to set expand on, else it's not 100 by 100 anymore. And that 100 by 100, what I'm going to do in a tween, when the texture bar fills up, when we unlock a skill, we'll start a bloom effect that will highlight the skill just for a second to let the player know that he has unlocked that skill. So to do that, we're basically in a tween going to set the scaling up. But when we set the scaling up, it's going to scale in the wrong direction. The reason being is that the pivot point is currently in the top left corner. So we have to set the pivot point to be in the center. Thereby it will scale around the texture and not to the side of it. So we're going to return this back to 0. And of course, we also don't want this texture rectangle to be here all the time. I mean, the skill doesn't look good anymore now. So in the visibility, I'm going to set this to show behind the parent. Now, we want, of course, this to be tween, so I'm going to be adding a tween to the texture rectangle, so we'll always know where this tween is for and where it's what it's going to be tweening. So it's a child of the texture rectangle. Now, at the same time, when we do this, the button doesn't become that clickable anymore because this texture rectangle is in front of it. Actually, it is clickable, but the hint won't work, because under the hint, what we're going to do is we'll add some text to it. So we'll say, okay, it's enforce, focus your key, and gain temporary boost, and combat focus, raising both attack and strength. So we'll add a little bit of a description to the tooltip hint. So right now we have pretty much our container done. All we have to do is rename it. I'm going to call this skill 1A. I'm not going to give it the enforce name because I want this to be a little bit of a flexible system. You will have to make a skill tree likely for every class or every skill tree that you have. The thing is that you're probably going to have different trees or different connectors, or not every skill tree is going to be exactly the same, although you could make it like that, but it's a little bit less creative, I guess. So you will have to make the skill tree. You could use some tab container on the top when a single character can maybe have skill trees from various, I don't know, walks of life. But we do want to make sure that we can in code use the same functions over and over again, referencing the same sort of connection logic. So we're going to call the skills first of one, as this is in row 1, so all skills in row 2 will start with a 2, and then we'll call them A, B, C, D, E from left to right. That way we can always sort of reference them easily, and then whichever tooltip we fill in there, or whichever picture is in there, is going to be determined on which skill tree is loaded at that moment. So that's sort of how you can make this a little bit more flexible, but at the same time reuse all the code that we'll be writing. Right, with that done, if we now would play this game, you can see that if we load this skill bar up now and I hover my mouse over here, the player is going to get a little bit of information here. What is this skill, etc., etc. You can add all kinds of stuff here. How much level do you need to unlock it? How much skill points is going to be required to use it? Whatever. If you are working on a mobile title, what you could do is that, of course, you don't have hover with your finger. That's not possible in touch. What you could do is that you click it, and then a new little window would appear where you get the information you want. And instead of, like we're going to program it, clicking this button to invest skill points, you would then, in that rectangular pop-up where you show the information, have the button spend skill points, or up, down, undo, whatever. So you can adjust this quite quickly to also work for mobile if you want to. Okay, with that done, we have ourselves a skill tree. So I'm going to be adding or duplicating this skill into all the bars and add all the correct textures to it that I need for the skill tree that we're going to be building. And then we'll add some margin probably. And then once we're back in the next section, we're going to be adding the connectors in the second Hbox container that we added, the skills connector. So we'll be overlapping the two. Right, we're back. We've got some extra skills. Let's add the last skill together so you know what I did, and you can see how easy this is once you set up your base container properly. I'm simply duplicating the skill with Ctrl D. I'm dragging it into the correct lane. First thing I'll do is I'll rename this to have the proper naming. So it's going to be skill 3A. And then in the texture button, I'll open the textures and I'll simply add the correct textures to it. That's all there's to it. Of course, you would also have to change the tooltip if you want to add all those tooltips everywhere. I'm not going to do that. I've shown you how that works, and we're more focused on the mechanics of the skill tree here in this tutorial. So with that done, we're going to make sure that all spaces out correctly. So we basically are going to make use of standard margin containers for that. The only exception is we need a label to tell us how many skill points we actually have. And I want to add that to the bottom left here. I'll rename this to skill points. And with that label, we'll say, for example, we got 3, I don't know, points. Points, good enough. We know we're in the skill tree already. We'll align this to center so that it looks better. And then under the custom fonts, we'll add the dynamic font for font 35 is probably big enough. Yeah, it's big enough. Then I'm going to give this a little bit of extra margin on the x-axis because I want this to always be the same size. It's quite important that we space this out evenly everywhere. So that is the 3 points, and that 150 is on purpose because I want all the margins to be standard 100, the same size as we made the skill buttons, and that's why that separation in the custom constants is so incredibly important. But we also want to add 50 margin to all the starting rows here, just like we had 50 margin between these buttons and the skill icons to make this look good. So I'm going to go over to one of the other buttons. I'll add a margin container to it. I'll drag it to the front of the stack and I'll rename it to front margin, so we know that we're dealing with something we shouldn't move at any time. We'll add 50 to it, I'll duplicate it, and I'll bring this into number 3 as well, where of course we got to make sure it's in the front and not in the back. I'll rename this just to be consistent, but that's not really necessary. We'll never reference these margins ever. With that done, we can simply no, you know what? We're not going to duplicate that because we don't want that name. We're just going to add a new margin container to it, and that margin container is going to be exactly 100 by 100, just like the skill icons. Now we want this free A skill to go to the side a little bit, so we'll just duplicate this until we think it's in the right position. Now this margin container, we can also, you know what? Let's just drag one over here to the other skill. We'll have a little bit of space between the two skills right here, and we'll also make sure that we have some space there. Now it looks like this margin container needs to be maybe giving a little bit of extra accent. Let's see. Maybe it's not necessary. Maybe this looks good like that. And we'll just duplicate it and drag this over into number 1. Then in number 1, we also have to make sure that we got the right spacing. That was not the right spacing. The right spacing in between these, and we'll duplicate this one too. Now this looks a little bit off, so probably what we need is we need to have one more margin to get the entire stack of I don't know what we call this, heavily strike, to have this a little bit more to the side. And maybe it's a good idea to add an extra 100 in between these two, just so they're not that much to the side. I'll make sure that it looks the way that I want it, but just remember that I always make sure that I use margin containers of 100 by 100. That's usually what I do to get things working, to space everything out quite easily. What I would do in a final product is, now that we got a number of margin containers here, like 5, I'll simply say, okay, I need this margin container. I'll put a size of 500 on the x-axis or on the x size, and then I'll delete the other 4. Why I do it like that? Because with 100 as a duplication, you can see it's quite easy to space something out, to delete one margin, add one here, add a little bit of space here, add a little bit of space there. That way we're just quicker building things up, and then when we know, okay, this looks good, then just change the real margins on and have one margin container, because that's of course always better than having 5. I'll work on that, and then I'll see you in a moment where we're going to add the connectors between the various skills. Right, let's connect these skills up, and that's where the magic, I guess, of 2 overlapping Hbox containers will come into play. So far, we've only worked in the skill tree Hbox container. Now we're going to be working in the skills connector Hbox container. Remember, the separation is also set to on at 0 and the alignment to end. Now we'll first add some margin to make sure that the connections come off the ground a little bit. We'll make sure that this is 100 high, because we only need, for the first connectors, to be connecting the top of the layer 1 buttons with the bottom of the layer 2 buttons. Bottom of the layer 2 buttons. Yeah, that's English. We're going to then connect or add an Hbox container. We'll drag this above the margin container because we want it to fill up to the top. And we'll set the rectangular size Y to 200. This way we're going to be overlapping, like I said, the top of layer 1 and the bottom of layer number 2. Now I've added a little bit of a helper texture rectangle here, just temporarily to show you what we're going to be doing. What we're going to be doing is we're going to make sure that here we have a box that's going to be connecting diagonally between these 2 skills. And here we need a box, not this big, smaller, but we need to be connecting there vertically. Now that means that we need to have some sort of a spacing tool to make sure that this all works properly. I can delete this texture rectangle now. Don't need that. Don't make that yourself. what I've done is that texture rectangle with 100 margin between two scale buttons and two scale buttons of 100 is of course 300 wide by 200 high, the size, the height of the swimming lane. Now I've added rectangles here in Photoshop for 100 by 100 to sort of replicate the situation that we are having. Then I've added a diagonal rectangle wide to the screen, and simply by hiding the rectangles now, we end up with a perfectly positioned white bar in a big canvas sized layer that we can add on top of that skill tree. Now of course I've done exactly the same for a diagonal line the other way, and I've done exactly the same for a vertical line, which I've then cut down to be only 100 pixels wide. So this is where my progress textures are coming from. So it's very easy to replicate this in Krita, maybe even Photoshop if you're good with Photoshop. So with that said, we'll first do this Hbox container. We'll first rename it to know what this is. This is of course swimming lane 1 to 2. And to swimming lane 1 to 2, we'll first add a margin container, because of course we need to replicate the 50 margin that we gave in the swimming lane of the skill icons as well. So we'll give this 50 margin. So we start at exactly the texture, and that is why it's so important to set all these separations on. Also in this swimming lane, I'm going to set the custom constants separation on separation 0, because we want all these elements of 100 wide to be pixel perfect, to make sure that this Hbox container elements are going to be overlapping nicely. So okay, we got some front margin. Now we'll add a texture progress. With the texture progress, we know that we want this one to be exactly 300 by 200. That's why it's overlapping exactly with the box underneath, or the skill tree underneath. Now the texture progress, we need two of these to overlap, because we have two on top of each other that are going to come out of the skill on the bottom and are going to go to the top. So to overlap these two, of course we can't have them both in the Hbox container, because that will try to pull them apart. So we're going to have to put them in the control node. We'll make sure that the control node is 300 by 200 and make sure that the texture progress takes the full rectangle of that. Now we can duplicate the texture rectangle and have two overlapping each other. Now with the texture rectangle, we're going to set the textures, and then we'll take the diagonal texture, the first one that will be to the left. We'll set the under texture, and we'll also set the progress texture. Now for the tint, as these are white, they're very easy to reset in color. So I'm going to go with 35. If I could type by 35 by 35 for the under texture, and for the progress we'll set a little bit of a softer. 255 is pure white, that's very hard on the eyes, so I'll lower this a little bit to 215. That is still white, but it's not as hard on the eyes. Now that's the same reason why you have your dark mode everywhere. For the value, for example, we can set this to 50, but now you see it fills it up entirely. That's because the fill mode is still from left to right. When we now do this from the bottom to the top, you can now see that we can imitate a progress. Of course, the 20 will be 20% of the screen, so it will come out at about 30 and it will go all the way up to about 70, 75 before the texture is filled. So you got to keep that in mind when you start programming this bar, but 50 is always going to be exactly in the center. So if, for example, the button skill has unlocked the next skill, but you haven't put any points in there yet, well, that's when you can show the 50% progress. Or when you have this skill and you put in the next skill point and that will unlock this one, you can show the bar go up, or you can pretty much do whatever you want with this sort of a texture progress, and you can sort of make that animation that many of these sort of skill trees have. Now with the other texture, we're going to do pretty much exactly the same. So I'll simply delete this one, duplicate this one, and I'll only be replacing the textures. Thereby I don't have to set all my tints again. So by simply replacing these, we'll now have two of these coming out. For the vertical box, we'll simply make another control node, And you might be wondering why another control node. Let me quickly get this one together. We'll put the vertical texture in the under, and in the progress we'll make sure that the control node itself knows that it is 100 by 200, and let's make sure that the texture progress knows that you shape the full rectangle. Now also for this texture rectangle, we'll put the progress on 50. We'll set it to fill from the bottom to the top, and the tint can for under be 35 by 35 by 35, and the progress 215 by 215 by 215. Now the reason why I, even though it's only one element, put this in a control node as well is because I want the node structure to be exactly the same. Whether we have two texture progresses or only one texture progress, yes, this control node for the sorting and the arrangement of the texture progress is not necessary, but to make sure that the node path is going to be exactly the same in the code, to approach this node in a single line of code exactly the same, whether it's diagonal or vertical, we need this extra control node in here. Now for the naming, I'm going to be renaming the control node itself equal to the skill that it comes from, and I'll rename the texture progress bars to the skills that the texture progress is going to. That way I can very easily approach, if I know, okay, skill number 1A unlocked skill number 2B, then I know I need to go into our swimming lane. I know I need to go into 1 to 2. I need to go into control node 1 A, equal to the skill name, and then I need to go to the skill that it has unlocked. This way I get a consistent node path towards the texture progress that I need to be activating to get the effect and the animation that we want for the particular skill we have unlocked. I'll do exactly the same for this one. I'll call this 1B, and the texture progress I'll rename to 2C. Now, of course, we need to add some extra margin in between. So let's make sure these are close to A. Yeah, that's correct. And let's add this, not this margin container, let's add it into 1 to 2 skill, add some margin to it. Needs to be in between these two. And of course, we know this needs to be exactly 100, actually 200 by 200, and that way our texture progress is exactly lined up there where we want it to be. Now I'll add the texture progress to the next swimming lane. I'll add the next swimming lane to it. I'll show you the final result. Now here we are. When we open up our character sheet, we got the stats panel. If we press skills, our skill bar, or our skill tree I should say, opens up, and right here we got a little bit of a situation which is possible. For example, this button skill has been unlocked. Apparently both skills on the second layer here are also unlocked, but only a point was invested in the second skill. And right here we have both skills unlocked, but apparently we don't have enough level, or we're not able yet to unlock the last skill right there. So it's grayed out, the button is disabled. Pop-ups still works, although that is the wrong pop-up as we copy pasted everything. But yeah, this is how something like this could look. And next tutorial we'll code in the logic and make sure that it's functional. That was it for today, guys. Hope you like it. If you did, smash that like button, hit subscribe. Don't forget that little bell icon to make sure that you don't miss out on the next video where we code that skill tree up. Now, if you're curious about the game development that I do myself, I'm working on a title called Soul Whisperer. I live stream my game development live on Twitch every Tuesday and Thursday. You can find the link in the schedule down in that description box below. I hope to see you there one day with all the Godot developers that are in the stream. Now, until then, or until the next tutorial, keep on gaming, keep on coding. See you later, guys.